There we go, guys. So now let's take a deep dive into what modifiers are and how we can use them. So remember when in the last video I was talking about, for instance, the bevel option for a cube, and we saw that unfortunately once we do a bevel, there's no way to modify it. Well, modifiers are a non-destructive way to work with certain assets inside of our scene inside of Blender, and they allow us to continuously change or iterate with the different things that we want. So for instance, if I grab this cube and I go to add modifier, we can grab a bevel modifier, which should be right here. And as you can see, we get a procedural bevel that's being applied to the whole object that allows me to change the intensity of the bevel, the segments of the bevel, and in general how well the bevel is looking. This is a way in which you can generate a piece. However, I do want to say from a professional experience that some of these things will need to be applied permanently once you bring this into an engine, because Unreal Engine, for instance, it does not know that this is a modifier. It just wants to know the final a geometry. There are really, really good ways to work with them, but again, in my personal experience, most of the times we're going to be applying some of these modifiers at the end. So how do we apply a modifier? How do we make a modifier permanent? Very easy. Just click on this little arrow right here and hit apply. And what that will do is now all of those things that the modifier did to the geometry have now been applied, and as you can see, the bevel is now permanent. So modifiers are really, really, really good. Again, we're going to be using them quite a bit to generate elements. And I'm going to go over the subdivision modifier again, because this is a very, very fun one. So this is our original element. And one of the last things that I did on the last video was that I right-clicked the object and changed the shade flat, which was the original one, which is this one right here, to something called shade smooth. Now we're gonna go back, or I'm gonna explain that in just a second. I'm gonna just right click and go back to shade flat to explain how the subdivision surface modifier works. So we select the object, we go to the modifier, and we're going to be using this subdivision surface modifier. And as you can see, everything becomes softer, everything becomes rounder. And the reason why this happens is because we're using a very famous a calculation called the Cadman-Clark subdivision approximation that allows us to generate more divisions on the object and therefore smooth out the distance between the vertices. I'm going to draw here real quick, because I do feel like this is a super important thing to know about. So right now we had the cube, and the cube was made in this way. And this cube had, oh, I thought we could have multiple. Okay, so we had this cube right here, and we had vertices on the cube, right? Well, when we use the Cadman-Clark subdivision approximation, what happens is the little algorithm finds out the position of the vertices, and it calculates a curve that's going to be created between those vertices. But if we have more vertices over here, it's also going to create a curve that's going to go over here, and then it's going to try to find the average for both of those curves and create the geometry that we want. So it smooths out the geometry by adding more elements and filling these curves that I'm showing you right there. So as you can see, right now we're using the subdivision approximation, but we got an interesting thing. We got levels, viewport, and render. What does this mean? Well, it means that when we are seeing the final render of the object, if I press Z and go to render mode, for instance, we're going to see, or actually not on this one, when we go render and render image right here, we're going to see an even smoother version of the element. Right now we're not seeing anything because we deleted the light, if you remember. Let me add it real quick. I'm just going to press Shift A. I'm going to go light, and we're going to add a point light. Just move it right around there for now. So now if we say render and render image, oh, the light's not intense enough. Okay, no, don't worry. We're going to talk about this later. So we got the cube right here, and we're using this subdivision approximation, right? If we go to the cube and we change the levels viewport to 2, now we're going to get the exact same thing that we would see on the render. So the cool thing, or one of the cool things about the subdivision approximation, is that we can work on a low poly version of the element, like a subdivision level 1, and on the render time we can go, I don't know, all the way to subdivision level 4, which if I bring it on my viewport, it's going to be really, really high, but it's also going to be really, really smooth, which looks very, very nice. The problem with using subdivision level 4 on our viewport is that this is way more information that my Blender scene has to calculate right now, and it's really not worth it. So usually, especially with the subdivision approximation or the subdivision modifier, we're going to be working at low levels here on the viewport, but we're going to keep high levels on the render to make sure that the final effect looks as good as possible. Now, if we do want to make this thing look a little bit better here inside of the render, one of the things that we can do is just right-click on top of the object and change the shade smooth. The shade smooth is a function. It's a way in which we shade the object, and as you can see, it gives us this sort of fake smooth effect. And it's really, really good to make things look a little bit better here on the viewport, even though eventually, for instance, we're going to be like subdividing them. If you have a powerful computer and you don't have any issues with subdivisions, you can definitely work with subdivision level 2, for instance, and get an even better result here with your die. So I'm just going to press a G and Z to push this up, and I want to build a little tower. So let's talk about orthographic cameras real quick. Right now we've all been working on this perspective camera, but there are a couple of cameras. We saw them before right here, the top view, right view, front view, all of these cameras that we can access to get a little bit more control over our objects. So the shortcut is on the number pad section. I'm not sure if all of you guys have a number pad. But again, if you're working on a small laptop, I would strongly advise that you get one of this, because there are some very, very cool shortcuts here that are used quite a bit. And yeah, if you're using a full keyboard, then that's perfectly fine as well. So if I press the number 1 on my number pad, this is going to be my front view. Very important, the front view. If I press number 3, this is going to be the right view or the side view that we also use quite a bit. If I press number 7, it's going to be the top view for my character. And if I press the number 0, I'm going to go to the render camera, which is this little icon right here. Is the camera that we have on the scene. As you can see right now, it's not perfectly framed, but that's the number 0. So 1, 3, 7, and 0 are very, very common like shortcuts that we're going to be using from our number pad. Another like a very important one is the little dot on your object. So if you click on an object and you hit the little dot, you're going to go and frame that specific object. So let's say I grab the camera and I press the dot. I'm going to jump to the camera. I grab the die and I press dot. I'm going to jump to the die. This is very important because a very common mistake is people will get lost on the viewport. Like they don't know where their scene is. It's like, oh my God, I'm completely lost. Don't worry. Just click your cube and then click dot on your number pad. And there you should be able to jump straight to it. Okay. So I'm not sure if it's supposed to be called dot, right? Or just point, or however you want to call it. It's just the one that's at the side of the 0. So let's go to the top view. And what I want to do is I want to create a couple of this die to just like make a small little scene. So I'm going to press a Shift D. And with Shift D, I'm going to be able to duplicate the object. By default, when you Shift D, you're automatically going to go into grab mode. So you're going to be able to like move this element to the side. Now, the cool thing with grab mode while you're in an orthographic view is that it gets constrained to the orthographic view that you're viewing. So in this case, since we're in the top view, it doesn't matter where I place this. I'm going to be perfectly sure that's still going to be on the floor because we're seeing this from the top. So we're not actually pushing it up and down. We're just moving it on the X and the Y axis. That's why I really like jumping into the side views or into the orthographic views, because it allows you to constrain the movements of the objects and give you a little bit more control. So let's do 4 of them. I'm going to do Shift D, 1 more, and then Shift D, 1 more. There we go. So we got 4 dice. Now, to make the scene a little bit more interesting, one of the things that we can do, of course, is rotate. And we can, again, go to the orthographic view and be like, okay, I'm going to rotate this. I'm going to rotate it like this. And there we go. So now number 3 is on the front instead of the number 4. If we then go to, let's say, the side view right here, I could also try rotating it. But of course, you can see that now the die is going to fall. But then we can go to the front view and rotate again and try to guesstimate this as best as possible. Something like that. So now we got a different set of faces like showing on my die. Remember that if you want to be super, super precise, you can always go to the object information right here. And for instance, I can see that my rotation on Y, it's minus 0.5. So I'm just going to leave this at 0 so that it's perfectly flat against the ground. You can also grab this one. And again, by pressing R, I can press, let's say, X and then just Control and just rotate this a couple of times until, let's say, the 6 is right there, 180 degrees. And then I can press R and the Z and rotate this again another like 160 degrees or something. There we go. I'm going to grab this one. I'm going to go to the number 1. And I'm going to press a G to move it up. I want to have this one on top of the other dice right there. So it's going to be right there. Then I can go to number 3, which is the side view. And again, with the letter G, just move it to the side and get it right there so that it's on top of the dice. If it feels like it's falling, I could even go to my top view and just move some of this guys right there so that it gets a little bit more support. Something like that. And once we're there, we can of course go to rotation, rotate this, let's say right there. Let's go to number 3, rotate rotation, and rotate this one right there. And that's how we can start building a more interesting scene here inside of Blender without really having to spend too much time, right? Like we spent some time modeling the little die, and once we had that, we are now able to create this little tower, and this should be more than enough to just give us an interesting effect. Let's push this one forward a little bit more, and there we go. Now, let's say we wanted to do a render, because everyone likes renders, and it's always nice when we can make things look nice. So I'm going to grab this little camera right here, and the first thing is I want to jump inside of the camera, press 0. Now, there are some shortcuts that by default are used here inside of Blender, but personally I find them very unintuitive. So I like when I can control this like shot cam as the perspective camera, and to do that, you're going to press N, and then we're going to go to View, and I'm going to use this option called Camera to View. So now the camera is going to move exactly like a view. I personally like to use this one. If you are familiar with the traditional Blender way to do it, feel free to use it as well. But I like to snap my camera to view, the shot cam specifically, so that it's a lot easier to use just a middle mouse, shift, and control, and all of the buttons that we normally use. So we're going to find a nice like composition, let's say something like that. Perfect. And then we're going to go back into number 0 so that we go back into perspective. Now, if I say render and I hit render image, we're going to get the nice composition of the render. We have no lights, but the composition is there. Let's add a couple of elements here. I'm going to press a Shift A. I'm going to add a mesh plane. I'm going to scale the plane very, very big so that it covers most of the area. And then I'm going to press a Shift A. I'm going to add another light, and I'm going to add a point light. I'm going to move the point light like up here. Now, the light also has an object transform, as you can see right here, so we can know the position and rotation and all that stuff. But the important thing about the lights is that it has a specific light options right here. So the object data will depend on what kind of object you have. For instance, in the case of a cube, of a geometric shape, we're going to be talking about UVs, faces, normals, vertices, and stuff like that. In the case of a light, we're going to be talking about the light properties. In the case of a camera, we're going to be talking about the camera properties. You can see the little green icon. That icon tells you what type of object we're working with. So I'm going to select this top light right here. And when this top light is selected, I'm going to start increasing the power. I'm going to go out to something like 100. If you want to see what the light is doing inside of your viewport before we go into render, you can press Z and go into render mode. And this is like, again, the render mode. Let's really bring this up, so like 1,000. And there you go. Now we can actually start seeing some light hitting our scene. Let's go 2,000. And that's it. So not bad. We're getting an interesting result. Now, the reason why we're seeing this sort of like gray color on other parts of the elements is because by default here on the world settings, which is another little section on our properties tab, the world settings actually has a gray color. If we bring that color down, as you can see, we're not going to see the color on the render. I personally prefer when the color is completely dark like this. Now, this only looks like this on the render side of things. When we go back to solid, we're still going to have our like basic like neutral gray color. So let's go back to C and render. Again, render is this little option right here. And now if I hit render and render image, we're actually going to be getting a nice, interesting image right here. I'm going to close this one again. I'm going to grab my light and I'm going to say Shift D, move it to the other side so we can get a little bit more illumination. And there we go. We can say render and render image. Now, I know this render looks very bad. It's part of how we start on the 3D world. But I just wanted to show you how you can do a small render. I actually encourage you to save this image. We can just say image, save. Again, I'm going to save it on the desktop for now, but we're going to be cleaning all of this up as soon as we move on to more complicated things. I'm going to call this D6 render. And especially I'm doing this for all of you guys that are first-time Blender users or first-time 3D users, because it's always, I find it always very cool to keep one of your first creations and then compare it to the end result of what you're going to be creating during this course. And you're going to be like, wow, I can't believe like 12 or 15 hours ago, I was only able to do a die, and now I can do this whole process. So yeah, that's pretty much it, my friends. I'm going to Control S to save, and we've now covered components, a little bit of the modeling tools, and a little bit of rendering even. So we're just going to go through a final exercise in this chapter 0. I'm going to be doing one of my classic like exercises. If you've watched any of my tutorials at another point, you're probably going to remember this. This is, of course, the barrel. We're going to be doing the ape's barrel. And yeah, Once we are completely sure that we understand how the general production workflow is going to work, we're going to be ready to start our pipeline with our Axe concept. So hang on tight, and I'll see you back on the next one.